All right, let's talk about one of the most fundamental institutions in American government, the United States Congress. It's designed to be the first branch, really the cornerstone of the whole republic.
So it's supposed to be the voice of the people. But how does an idea, any idea, maybe even one you have, actually make it through the maze on Capitol Hill and become the law of the land? It's a process that can seem incredibly complex, and as it turns out, that's kind of by design. So let's dive in.
To really get how Congress works today, you've got to rewind the clock. We're going way back to its creation at the Constitutional Convention of 1787. The country was, frankly, on the verge of failure under the old Articles of Confederation, and the delegates were seriously divided on what to do next.
This image here really gets to the heart of the conflict. You had the big states, like Virginia, arguing that representation should be based on population. More people, more power. But then you have the smaller states, like New Jersey, who were terrified of being overpowered and demanded equal power for every single state. These were two totally different visions.
So you had two competing proposals. The Virginia plan, which the big states loved, called for a bicameral, or two-chambered legislature with representation tied to population. Simple. But the smaller states countered with the New Jersey plan, which wanted a unicameral, a single-chamber Congress, where every state got one vote no matter how big or small.
And let me tell you, this debate was so fierce it nearly derailed the entire convention. The solution, which came from delegates from Connecticut, became known as the Great Compromise. It was kind of a brilliant move, actually. It just merged both plans, creating the system we have today, a two-chamber Congress. You get the House of Representatives, where power is based on population, and the Senate, where every state gets 2 seats. Problem solved? Well, mostly.
Because settling the question of representation between states just opened up another, much darker debate. When you're counting a state's population to figure out how many representatives it gets, do you count enslaved people? Southern delegates insisted that they should, and this led to one of the most shameful clauses in the original Constitution.
This became known as the Three-Fifths Compromise. And let's be really clear about what this did. For the purpose of representation in Congress, slave-holding states were allowed to count 60%, or 3/5 of their enslaved population. This was never about giving a voice to the enslaved. It was about inflating the political power of the states that held human beings in bondage.
So all of that history brings us to the structure we have today. In the House, you have 435 members. They serve short 2-year terms, which means they have to stay really tuned in to what their voters want right now. Then you have the Senate, 100 members, 2 from each state. They serve longer 6-year terms, which by design allows them to take a longer view and maybe cool the passions of the moment.
Okay, so we've got the blueprint down. We know the structure, but how does the work actually get done? Let's follow the journey of a single bill, from just an idea to a potential law.
Now, the spark of an idea can come from literally anywhere. It could come from a citizen, an advocacy group, or even the president. But here's the catch. No matter how great the idea is, it's dead on arrival unless a member of Congress, a representative or a senator, agrees to sponsor it and officially introduce it as a bill.
Once a bill is introduced, it doesn't just go straight to a big vote. No, first it has to survive what's basically a legislative gauntlet, the committee system. This is where the nitty-gritty, detailed work of Congress really happens.
And this is the great filter of our legislative process. The overwhelming majority of bills that get introduced, they never make it out of this stage. They get studied, they get debated, and then, most of the time, they are quietly left to die in committee, never to be heard from again.
So what exactly is going on inside these committees? Well, first, they hold hearings where they bring in experts, advocates, and officials to testify. Then comes what's called a markup session. That's where committee members literally mark up the bill's text, proposing changes and amendments. And finally, the committee votes on whether or not to even send the bill to the full chamber.
Now if, and it's a big if, a bill survives committee, it moves on to the main event, a debate and a vote on the floor of the full House or Senate.
So out on the floor, the bill is debated by everybody. If it passes with a simple majority, great. But hold on, it's not a law yet. Now it has to go all the way over to the other chamber and survive the exact same process: committee, floor debate, and another vote. And since the House and Senate often pass slightly different versions of the bill, a special conference committee has to meet to iron out one single identical bill. Only then can it finally go to the president.
Now, the Senate has this one unique and pretty controversial tool that can stop a bill dead in its tracks: the filibuster. Because the Senate has a tradition of unlimited debate, a single senator can basically hold the floor and talk for as long as they want to prevent a bill from even coming to a vote. To break a filibuster, you need a supermajority of 60 votes, which makes it an incredibly powerful weapon for the minority party.
So if a bill somehow survives all of that, it finally lands on the president's desk. The president has two choices: sign it and it becomes law, or veto it and send it back. Now, Congress gets one last shot. They can override that veto, but it is incredibly difficult. It requires a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate.
You know, this whole complicated process, it really brings us full circle, right back to that fundamental question of representation. And the struggle over who gets to be represented and how didn't just end with the Constitution. It is a living, ongoing story.
For instance, right after the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, Southern states passed a whole series of laws that came to be known as the Black Codes. These were designed to get around the 13th Amendment, restricting the rights of Black Americans to own land, find work, or vote, essentially trying to maintain a system of white supremacy.
The fight against these kinds of discriminatory laws took a full century. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was an absolutely monumental piece of legislation that finally knocked down many of the legal barriers at the state and local levels that have been used for decades to keep African Americans from exercising their constitutional right to vote.
And this long, complicated history brings us right to a key question for today. How well does Congress actually look like the country it represents? We call this descriptive representation. If you look at the 117th Congress, for example, you can see some pretty big gaps. In terms of gender, women make up more than half the U.S. population, but they were just under 27% of Congress.
And if we look at race and ethnicity, it's a similar story. Now, the 117th Congress was one of the most diverse in history, which is significant. But its membership is still not a perfect mirror of the nation. For example, white Americans make up about 76% of Congress, while they're closer to 60% of the total U.S. population.
So in the end, the story of Congress, from its very first foundational compromises through that whole complicated gauntlet of lawmaking to what it looks like today, it is the story of America. It's a messy, ongoing, and often really difficult conversation about who we are and who gets to hold power in this country. The framers built a system that was designed to be slow, to be deliberative, to not change on a whim. But as our country keeps changing, demographically, technologically, socially, the big question for all of us is this: how does this first branch of government, this foundational institution, need to evolve right along with it?